The exotic spices we've been talking about up to this point come from the near, middle, and far east. They make their way by camel caravan to the Mediterranean and then by boat to northern Europe. They go from one middleman to another, from this distributor to that middleman, and each person wants to add a little bit of money to the cost of those spices. Long story short, by the time they get to northern Europe, they're incredibly expensive. And there's every reason that people are willing to pay that price. The food way back when wasn't exciting as it is today. They didn't have refrigeration. You only had seasonal fruits and vegetables available to you. If you slaughtered an animal, there was no refrigeration, and so you salted it very heavily. And while it might be safe to eat, there's a good chance that the fat would go rancid, and spices against that backdrop could make food palatable and exciting. Still in all, it was expensive. So, typically spices were reserved for special occasions, things like holidays. Take a look at what I've got laid out right here. I've got gingerbread made from ginger. I've got spice cake down here with cinnamon and caraway. There's a cinnamon bread right here. There's a Scandinavian bread with lots and lots of cardamom in it. All of these things are an expression of how exotic spices make their way into the Northern European food tradition. But it's not just about flavor. There was the idea, anyhow, that many of these spices had medicinal properties. So, as an example, pepper is a very strong anti-botulism agent. You could, at one point, buy pepper for its weight in gold. An ounce of pepper would cost you an ounce of gold. And during the plague, they believed that nutmeg was a preventative for the plague. And it's said that a pound of nutmeg was worth 7 oxen. The relationship that Northern Europeans have with exotic spices is a little bit different than what we've seen up to this point, and that's what I'd like to explore in this episode. Let's make a Hungarian goulash with a lot of Hungarian paprika. Here in this pan, I've got some beef. I wanted a really rich, flavorful cut of meat, and so I'm using beef shank that was cut up about 3/4 of an inch on a side, and I've got it browned pretty nicely now. I used a flavorful fat. I used duck fat. Duck fat has a tremendous amount of flavor, as does lard, as does bacon fat. If none of those appeal to you, don't feel bad if you just use vegetable oil. I think that's entirely appropriate. With the meat browned, what I want to do is introduce some onions to this pan, and we're going to let those cook along with the meat until they're translucent. I'm going to add a little bit more fat. The moisture from these onions will begin to deglaze this pan, which is to say, take the meat drippings that are clinging to the pan and free them. I don't want to put a lot of color on these onions. I want them to become sweet and translucent. There'll be plenty of bite in this dish from the paprika to come. All right, while these are cooking, let's talk a little bit about paprika. All paprika comes from chilies, and all chilies got their start in the Americas. They belong to a family of plants called capsicums, and there's a lot of variety within the capsicums. Anyhow, explorers brought the seeds of capsicums back with them to Europe, and when you take those seeds and you plant them in new soil with a different climate, what you can expect is a very different result. Capsicums began this process of transforming themselves once they were planted in Europe. Also, the people in Europe didn't have the same taste for really spicy food that they do in the Americas. And so what you began to see is they would save the seeds from milder chilies and discard the ones from hotter chilies. Little by little, capsicums evolved, and we ended up with a group of chilies that give us paprika that aren't nearly as hot as what we found in Mexico. So, in Europe, there's 2 areas that are well known, renowned in fact, for the quality of their paprika. One of them is Spain, and the other is Hungary. Hungarian paprika and Spanish paprika. Now, In Spain, what they do is they take the chilies and they dry them over a slow, smoky fire. And so Spanish paprika oftentimes has a little smokiness, not a little smokiness, actually a very distinctive smokiness. They call it pimentón. And you can get pimentón in sweet or dulce or picante. I've got a can of pimentón right here, and you can see on the bottom it says dulce. Now, what's significant about this is that paprika, once it's ground up fine, begins to lose its aroma and lose some of its essential oils. So you want to care for it very well. If you can buy it in a can that blocks it from light, if you can keep it cool, if you can keep a lid on it to protect it from air, and then finally, if you can only buy enough so that you can use it up in 6 months to a year, I would say that is ideal. What makes a chili powder hot, whether it's paprika or another varietal chili powder, is capsaicin. That's the compound that makes chilies hot. And if you take a chili, in the ribs on the inside of that chili, you will find 60% of the capsaicin. In the seeds, you'll find 20%, and the remaining 20% of the heat is in the flesh itself. So, if you leave some of the seeds and the ribs in, you'll get a hotter paprika than if you take them out. As a broad rule of thumb, Hungarian paprika tends to be a little bit spicier than Spanish paprika, which is to say they leave more of the seeds and the ribs in. If you have a sweet paprika and you want it to be spicy, put just a little bit of cayenne in there and you're on the right track. Okay, these onions look almost ready to go. I've got just enough time to tell you about another spice that's going to make its way into this dish, and that is caraway. Now, caraway is one of the few exotic tasting spices that's indigenous to Northern Europe. So it doesn't come from the Far East. It likes a temperate climate, and it walks a thin line between herb and spice. Herbs typically are the part of the plant that is tender. It may be leaves or blossoms, flowers. Spices are the part of the plant that are more fibrous and tough, things like stalks, bark, seeds, and stems and roots. If you choose, you can use some of the greenery from the caraway plant, but we're going to use the seeds today. I want to crush these up. If you have a spice mill at home or a mortar and pestle, that would be a great tool to use. But take a look at this. I have a pan, and I'm just going to rock the heel of that pan over these spices on a wooden cutting board. And very, very quickly, the spices will break open and release their oils. If you have a little saute pan, that would work just as well. All right, so we're ready to move on with our goulash. The onions are translucent. I'm going to add some garlic to this pan. And as soon as the garlic is aromatic, I'm going to add quite a bit of paprika, probably more than you might expect. I want to wake up the flavor of that spice in hot fat, and so I'll add just a little bit more hot fat. And before I add it, one word of caution. Ground spices burn very, very easily, so turn the temperature down just a little bit and have a little bit of liquid. I've got some wine here that I can add to stop the high temperature cooking. All right, here we go. In goes the paprika. And as soon as it hit the heat, I got this wonderful nose hit of spiciness and depth of flavor. If you're worried about this burning at all, pull it off the heat and add some liquid. Once it's aromatic, you know you've woken those flavors up. And if you don't smell anything, it's entirely possible that you've kept your paprika for too long. All right, next step, we're going to deglaze this pan, which is gather up all of the solids that are clinging to the pan with a little bit of white wine. The other nice thing about white wine is it brings some acidity to this dish. and that'll help cut through some of the fattiness of the meat. I'll turn the temperature back up so that can reduce, and I'm going to also add the caraway. Now, caraway, as I said, it's indigenous to areas with temperate climates. You see it all over Europe, and they use it with the things that they have available there. They eat it with meat, but especially rich meats, because they'll tell you that it makes the meat easy to digest. So things like pork and goose and duck. It makes its way into potato dishes. It makes its way into rye bread, into sauerkraut. There's even a schnapps called Kümmel that I grew up with in Germany that is flavored with caraway. The caraway is here because it makes this dish easier to digest. Okay, this is reduced down to a syrup almost, and I'm going to introduce some chicken stock. We'll get plenty of beef flavor from the meat that's in this pan. And once it comes up to a boil, we'll reduce it to a simmer. If any foam comes up, we can skim that off. And the beef shank, while it's a little bit tough, it should cook within about 45 minutes or so. We want the meat to be fork tender. Just dip a piece out and taste it, and I think you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Once the meat is tender, or almost tender, what we're going to do is add a couple of more ingredients. We're going to add some green peppers. And obviously I'm jumping ahead here, but we're going to add green peppers, we're going to add tomatoes, and we're going to add some diced potatoes. And the potatoes will begin to cook, and the starch will thicken the broth further. The tomatoes will fall apart and flavor the goulash, and the peppers won't cook for so long that they fall apart and become indistinguishable. At the same time, I'm going to throw in some branches of thyme, I'm going to throw in some marjoram, and I'm going to throw in some bay leaf, and all those things can cook for probably another half an hour until all the vegetables are tender. Here's what it looks like when all is said and done. I've got the goulash here. The peppers and tomatoes and the potatoes, they're all cooked. If I dip in here, what you can see is the branches of thyme have given up. I'm just going to pluck those out. And it's taken on a certain body. It's got a definite viscosity to it. And we are just about ready to serve this dish. I'm going to make sure that it comes up to a nice simmer. Right at the end, I like to add a little bit of lemon zest to brighten the preparation up. So I'm going to do that right now. And we'd be remiss if we didn't taste it. There's a lot of flavor in this. So remember, before when we were seasoning mole that had so much flavor, it took quite a bit of salt. That lemon zest just wakes up this dish. It's really delightful. If you like it spicier, you could certainly add some black pepper, or maybe even more appropriate, you could add a little bit of cayenne pepper. I'm going to put a sprinkle of black pepper in here. And I think this dish is ready to go. If you can make this a day ahead and refrigerate it, it'll be even better tomorrow. It might be a little thicker. You may have to add some liquid to it, but as dishes like this sit, the flavor of the spices tends to get even more robust. I'm going to make a simple little salad to go on top. It's going to be cooked carrots and a little bit of dill and a little bit of parsley. And I'm going to squeeze some lemon juice on that salad, and that will be our garnish. I'm going to spoon some of this goulash right into a serving bowl. This could also be considered a stew as well as a soup. For me, the big difference is how big you cut the meat. But whether you think of it as a stew or a soup, it's delicious either way. And then just to bring some freshness to this long simmered dish, I'm going to put a dollop of sour cream, which is distinctively Northern European, right on top. And we'll toss this salad together, and a little three-finger pinch of this carrot and dill salad, I think, will make a really nice addition to this goulash. So there you have it. We're in Northern Europe. We're enjoying some of the spices that are indicative to Northern Europe, and I don't think for a second that you'll miss the exotic spices we've been talking about up to this point. I decided I wanted to do something with juniper. Juniper is a spice that you will find growing all over the Northern Hemisphere. It's a berry from a tree, and it's very, very prolific. I've got some juniper right here, and it has, when you taste it, the flavor of gin. But more than that, it tastes of citrus, it tastes woody, it has a little bit of sweetness to it, and then this underlying bitterness. It's very complex, and it's really haunting. I wanted to do something with Northern European ingredients, so I've got apples, goat cheese, and beets. But the first thing I want to do is make the vinaigrette so the flavor of the juniper can get into the vinaigrette, and then we'll finish up with this salad. All right, so I'm going to make the vinaigrette in a little jar like this, and in the bottom I will put an emulsifier, mustard, and what this will do is it'll help keep the oil and the liquid combined with one another. Next, I'm going to add some shallots to this jar. A little bit of salt. Actually, salt is here. And then we want to make a point of putting 1 part acid to 3 parts oil. So the acid that I'm going to use is both lemon juice and vinegar. And if that's 1 part, then here is 3 parts oil. Now, the juniper needs to be ground up, and I have a spice grinder here. You could also use a mortar and pestle if you have one at home. I'm going to put it in. I would say it's always better to use whole spices. Whole spices hold on to their flavor for a lot longer, and then when you need them, you can grind them up. This is one of the treats of using whole spices, is that when you grind it, you're the first to get to enjoy its wonderful aroma. All right, I'm going to add probably about a teaspoon, maybe 2 teaspoons of juniper. I want this to be really distinctive. Then finally a little bit of pepper, and to make this vinaigrette, we'll put a lid on, hold it tight, and shake like a madman. I guess I should have the lid on just a little tighter. There we go. And we're off and running. Now, I'll set this dressing aside. These ingredients we can set aside. I've got some beets, and I've roasted some of them. Here they are, raw still. When you cook beets, your challenge is to get them tender without losing their red color. And what I typically do is I leave the peel on them. Whether you boil them or whether you roast them, leave the peel on because that keeps the color inside. The pigment that gives beets their color is water soluble. So if you peel them first and then cook them, they can look a little bit anemic. I also leave a little piece of the root and a little piece of the stem on so that it doesn't bleed color from either end. The greens are entirely edible, so if you have greens, treat them just like chard or escarole, put them into a pasta, don't waste them. What I did here is I took these beets and I roasted them. Now, you know that they're done when you can pierce them easily with a knife, but once they're cooked, you should be able to just rub the skins right off the beet. And I'm doing it with a paper towel, otherwise my hands will turn red. But there's the skin all removed. I'll discard that. There is still the top on, so I'm going to trim that off, and maybe a little bit of the root end on, so I'll trim that off as well. And then these beets are just going to be quartered. Good. So I've got them all gathered up. I'm going to put them into a bowl, and in effect what I'm going to do is make pickled beets. And I'm going to do it by adding some of our vinaigrette. We'll stir that together. I want to be able to taste that juniper even more, so I'm going to add another little pinch of juniper and some salt, and those are ready to go. Now you can see beets make a little bit of a mess of things, so what you want to do is wash this cutting board sooner rather than later, otherwise it'll be stained for a week or two. If this bothers you, just put a piece of parchment or a piece of saran down and work on top. All right, the greens I've got need to be pretty assertive because these beets are assertive. And so I've got watercress here and some other bitter greens. I'm going to gather a plate up and make a little bed of these greens. I'm going to spoon some of these beets around. I've got apples, and I think we can just tuck those in here and there. I didn't mix them in with the beets because the beets will stain almost everything red. So just be a little bit careful about when and what you add to the beets. Goat cheese, I'll sprinkle on top. Another fixture in Northern European culinary scene. And then finally, some toasted walnuts. And these I'm just going to chop up. And these will be a garnish on my salad. There's our vinaigrette. I'm going to drizzle a little bit over the greens just so that I'm confident that they're well seasoned. I like drizzling the vinaigrette over after the fact so that the greens don't mat together, especially more tender greens. And I will often just squeeze a little bit of bright lemon juice over before I serve it. Sprinkle on the nuts. Make sure the plate's nice and clean. And this pickled beet salad with juniper vinaigrette is done and ready to be enjoyed. We've had a really delicious, rich goulash. We've had a salad with roasted beets and goat cheese that had a juniper vinaigrette on it, and now it's time for dessert. I've got a couple of different things planned, but most importantly, I want to show you a technique for extracting flavor from spices that doesn't use heat, but instead uses alcohol. Every culture that has wine likely at some point will warm that wine and add spices to it. So I'm going to do that for you very, very quickly. I'm going to put some water in this pan, and I'm going to create a sugar syrup. And we're going to flavor that sugar syrup with spices. Now think about this for a second. When I'm drinking wine, it would be great if there was a cinnamon stick or a piece of star anise. But to have ground spices in there would make it almost like a sandy, wet mess. So keep the spices whole. I'm not even going to break them up. Instead, we'll use this heat and later on the alcohol that's in this wine to extract the flavor from the spices. Take a look. I'm going to add some cinnamon sticks here to this pan. I'm going to throw in a couple of cloves, some cardamom, whole cardamom pods, a couple of pieces of ginger, a couple of slices of orange, and then the star anise that we saw earlier in China that has such a wonderful fragrance is going to make its way in there as well. Once this comes up to a boil, the heat will draw the flavor out of those spices. Now that the syrup has come up to a boil, I can already begin to smell the aroma of those spices. I'm going to turn it down, and I'm going to add some red wine. A fruity red wine that has a little bit of body, I think, is a nice idea. And from this point forward, I don't want to cook this too aggressively. In fact, I just want to keep it warm so that as people come to your party, they can have a glass of this warm wine. In Scandinavia, it might be called glögg. In Germany, it's called Glühwein. Mulled wine in England. As I said, every culture has their version of this dish. So let's let that sit over a very low heat, and the little bit of long simmering and the alcohol will draw the flavor out of those spices. Next, I'd like to make a really simple dessert. And while it's a great recipe, what I want to show you is that you can draw the flavor out of spices not with heat and not with simmering, but with alcohol. So I'm going to take a bowl, and in that bowl I'm going to put some orange zest. Next, I'm going to add spices to that bowl, and I'm going to crush them because these will be strained out later on. I've got cloves, I've got cardamom, and I've got cinnamon. I want to break the cardamom pods open. I want to crush the cinnamon into smaller pieces. In effect, I want to maximize the surface area. Okay, when you can smell it, that's probably enough. I'm going to gather this up. That goes into the bowl as well. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some alcohol. I've got some sweet white wine. I've got a little bit of sherry for nuttiness. And then I want to bring the alcohol level up with some brandy. Just some sugar in that. And I'm going to set this aside overnight. And what will happen is the alcohol will draw all of that wonderful flavor and aroma out of this preparation. So what I have here is exactly the same thing. It's been sitting overnight. You don't even need to refrigerate it because it's got so much alcohol in it. And it's incredibly complex. There's a lot of different flavors going on there. The camphor bite of the cardamom, the wonderful citrusiness of this orange, the sweetness of cloves and of cinnamon. I'm going to take this orange and just add a little bit of orange juice to this as well. And then we'll strain all of the spices out. They've done their work by this point. And I'm going to add cream to this. This is heavy cream, whipping cream. And we're going to start the process of whipping this cream. Now, you've likely whipped cream before, but this behaves just a little bit differently. Because of the acidity and the alcohol in the wine, it thickens up and tightens a little bit more quickly than you might expect. All right, this is very, very close to being done. Make sure you don't whip it stiff. I want it to be sort of sensuous and soft. When it starts to hold a shape and it starts to streak the bottom of the bowl, I think that's enough. All right. This is like the best whipped cream you've ever had because it's not just the cream, but it's all those wonderful flavors that we infused through the action of alcohol as a solvent into this preparation. To serve this, some people spoon it just into a bowl like this. I like to put some preserves on the bottom. Sometimes it's strawberry and rhubarb. Other times it's stewed raspberries like I have here. I have even crumbled up ginger cookies and put them into the bottom of this bowl, which is especially nice if it sits for a while. Because the ginger cookies soften up. Next, I'm going to take the syllabub, which is what this is called from the English tradition, and I'm going to put this right on top. And I think just a few toasted nuts and maybe a little pinch of cinnamon. And I serve that with my favorite spice cookies. Now, remember, we've got some mulled wine that's been simmering away here, and it is ready to go. What I'd like to do is ladle some into a glass. And I wouldn't be shy about including some of the spices, whether it's a little piece of star anise or cardamom pods. We can dress it up with a little wheel of citrus. And there is a very simple holiday dessert. So we've taken a little tour of Northern Europe, and what's interesting to me is that while we saw a lot of spices, none of them are the exotic spices that we've been dealing with from other parts of the world. And yet, these dishes are no less delicious.